Yes, hello. Thank you for the introduction. The guidelines I will be presenting are part of a bigger whole, which is called Design Guidelines for Pedestrian Infrastructure. This was commissioned by the Minister of Infrastructure. The guidelines come as a response to the worldwide trends on how to plan and design the human environment. This is a departure from designing for cars, and this is now the trend is to design for people. And as a consequence, in Poland, at the national level, we don't have complex or general guidelines for designing pedestrian accidents, even though some of these cities in fact have such standards. The guidelines, the standards are developed to ensure that pedestrians and other pedestrian infrastructure users are safe and feel comfortable, and we want to encourage walking. So the objective is to coordinate the development and improvement of the quality of pedestrian infrastructure, is to develop uniform procedures and standards for planning and designing of infrastructure, and to help with the cooperation between planners and designers. So planning for pedestrians means that the infrastructure has to meet the needs and the features of pedestrians, especially when it comes to routes, the time and the speed. Pedestrian infrastructure should meet the needs of universal design, and this means that it should be useful for all age groups and people with special needs. Pedestrian infrastructure should ensure safety, accessibility, directness, comfort, and effectiveness. Whether it's a city, a district, or a residential area, having routes for walking are really important. So walking routes combine sources and destinations of pedestrian trips, and they are part of different traffic generators. And so it's people walking to parks or bus stops, etc. And they should ensure that the links are as direct as possible, the routes should be as short as possible, and they shouldn't require the pedestrian to walk the extra mile or to engage into too much physical activity. So the technical solutions should be uniform and ensure the highest safety and ease of use. Elements of walking routes. We have linear and point elements. According to universal design principles, these routes have to meet the needs of everyone, and that's why these elements have to meet specific parameters. And what they are is presented in the respective volumes of the pedestrian infrastructure design guidelines. And so these things have to be decided when the pedestrian infrastructure is first designed. Our proposal for the guidelines is to use a procedure for planning walking routes. It's like a step-by-step set of things to be done. And there are three main stages. Number one is to assess existing and planned pedestrian infrastructure. And obviously, I won't go into the details of this. We have a number of criteria and indicators to help with the characteristics, even if there is a shortage of data. We have to identify the demand for walking, and we have to have a plan to develop pedestrian infrastructure. So demand for walking. When we do this, first we have to designate traffic generators. And as I said, they would be shops, public buildings, residential areas, public transport stops, recreation areas. And so for each traffic generator, we will identify access routes, and they represent the area of acceptable access. That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, depending on the particular generator, they are also helpful with defining the category of the particular route. So identifying these generators is useful because that way we can identify demand for walking and identify the directions where we can build such a matrix as in drawing 3. And then we can do the spatial distribution, and we can use a simulation model and calculate that into the steps, number of steps by a pedestrian. We've identified 3 categories of walking routes, and that depends on what the links are in terms of where that is. Well, we have 3 routes: multifunctional, recreational, and transport route. But we also have a school route and a disabled route. If these are particular routes that are mostly used by school children, for example, or by people with disabilities. Now we have 3 technical classes for walking routes. This is particularly important when we choose the devices and parameters which are good for walking. But it's also about maintenance standards. The higher the category, the better the maintenance standards. So when we plan walking routes, or just developing a plan of walking routes, there are several stages to observe. For example, to identify the missing elements. So first we have to do an inventory of what's there, then we have to fill in the gaps. We develop a project, we identify corridors and zones, we do pre-selection, and we have a round of public consultations, and that's an important part of it. When we develop a network of walking routes, we have to decide on the hierarchy of the routes. So in drawing 1, the yellow sections are what needs to be added. And then point 2, we have a division into categories in terms of access to traffic generators. We have a traffic forecast. That's number 3. And this is the basis for identifying the technical classification. And once we know the location or classification of the routes, then it's very likely that some of the plans, such as land use plans or development plans, well, perhaps it would be a good idea to include the planning of walking routes as part of land use plans. As I mentioned, When we do the classification, we also use traffic corridors and zones. We decided to use corridors and zones because corridors are usually designed for motor traffic, and zones usually give more priority to pedestrians. And the main difference is the speed and priority. For each zone, there is a principle for pedestrian traffic. The space is divided into streets, road surfaces, and pavements. There is also a rule on where pedestrian crossings should be and whether we should use traffic calming measures. So our guidelines also help select pedestrian infrastructure, and we'll have the details of that in part 3 of the guidelines. And once this initial plan is ready, it should have a descriptive and a graphic part with the maps of walking routes divided into functional categories, technical classes, zones, and then corridors of traffic, and also a map of the key point infrastructure for pedestrians. So this is the initial plan, which should then be consulted as part of a public consultation. There has to be the public consultation element. After all, the design is for pedestrians, and they will be the end users. Not consulting them wouldn't make much sense. And then we get to the final plan, and the final plan should have a program and a timeline for how those walking routes, or when those walking routes will be built. To summarize, we've identified the main elements there in our proposal, but first of all, we have specific definitions, and then we've cleared some of them. We have a comprehensive approach to planning of walking routes. There is a functional classification and a technical one when it comes to walking routes. We described step by step the planning procedures for walking routes, and we've described the basic rules for planning networks of walking routes. Thank you very much. If there are any questions or suggestions.